Absolute versus relative cell references. We've discussed how cell identity assignments are based on a cell's position in a grid and referenced in the name box here on your Excel desktop. Yet there's a bit more to understand about cell references than just A1, B6, or L17. A cell can be addressed as either a relative or an absolute cell reference, and there's a big difference between the two. Which you use depends on what you need your spreadsheet to do and the way you've set it up. By default, Excel assumes that you want to use relative cell references or addresses in your worksheet. What this means is that when you adjust your worksheet or copy or move a formula elsewhere in your worksheet, the cell references adjust themselves to fit the changes. Here's an example. Let's say you have a formula you use to add up entries in column C, and you want to copy that same formula to add up subsequent columns. So you copy it to columns D, E, and F. By assuming relative addressing, Excel assumes that what you want to do is to adapt the formula to fit the other rows the formula is being copied to. Thus, Excel adjusts the cell references in the formula to add the contents of the D column, for example, and the E column, and the F column, rather than going back and referencing the C column as it did originally. This makes sense for a great many situations and lets you make modifications to your worksheet on the fly, while Excel adjusts everything to fit those changes. However, you'll possibly find that there are times when you may prefer to use what is known as an absolute cell reference. You'll use this type in situations where you always want the formula to refer to a particular cell, regardless of where you may move the particular formula. There are also different ways that you can assign absolute references. For example, you can have a cell reference that refers to an absolute column and an absolute row. And the difference between a relative cell reference that might look like this and an absolute column and row cell reference is that it looks like this. Here we're referring to an absolute column and an absolute row cell reference of C7, which differs quite a bit from the normal relative cell reference of C7. Notice the dollar signs. Whichever part of the cell reference has a dollar sign just before it, this makes it an absolute cell reference. So here's an example of an absolute row and an absolute column cell reference. You can also have an absolute column and a relative cell reference. For example, here we'll use a dollar sign in front of the C because we're using an absolute column reference, but we don't put a dollar sign in front of 7, which is the row reference. You can also have a relative column reference, such as C, but an absolute row reference, such as $7. You could also have a relative row and a relative column, which is what you see with C7. This is all relative. But these are just examples. So when you see a dollar sign or you use a dollar sign in reference to an actual cell reference itself, this means that you're giving it an absolute reference point to a particular column or row or to both.